titled Baba Hu. It's based on a Qawwali song called Allahu. Allahu is an Islamic name for God. Hu means God. So Baba Hu means Baba God. This song was in fact sung for Baba at Meherzad, sometime in the 50s, I think it was. Now, there's a story when the original words are in, I think, Urdu. Bal Kalchuri wrote the first verse in Hindi, which we'll be trying to sing, and I wrote several English verses. When we first sang this song for Erich, it brought to mind a story which he told me to tell in singing this song. One time when he was driving Baba somewhere, I think in North India, and it was, I think, late at night, and over the sound of the car, Baba heard a sound and asked him to slow down and then to stop. And there was some kind of a singing or chanting from in the woods, and Baba wanted to go and see. So they went through the woods, and there was a circle of men standing around, all singing Allahu, 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 just chanting that. And Baba stayed and listened for a time and then left. And it makes me think that as we sing Baba Hu, although Baba doesn't seem to be here now, perhaps he will be gracious enough to attend our singing. The chorus is very easy. The words are Baba Hu. It just sings that over and over. Please join in. Baba Hu, 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 Baba Hu. Roshani Jabnati Andhera Jabnatha, Roshani Jabnati Andhera Jabnatha, Admi Jabnate Asima Jabnatha, Admi Jabnate Asima Jabnatha, Kisi ka patana ta koi Jabnatha, Kisi ka patana ta koi Jabnatha, Jab kuch khana yahan, Jab kuch khana yahan, Tuta aur tu hi tu, Baba Hu, 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 B hoo, baba, hoo, baba, hoo, baba, hoo, baba, hoo, baba, hoo, baba, baba, hoo, baba, hoo, baba, hoo, 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 baba, 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 hoo. When no night was nor light was, when urge did not surge, when no night was nor light was, when urge did not surge, when the sleep was so deep that no eye could emerge, when the sleep was so deep that no eye could emerge, before youth sprang in laughter or death droned its dirge, before youth sprang in laughter or death droned its dirge, before one became two, before one became two, there was no one but you, baba, hoo, 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 baba, hoo. When God's whim made the ocean a bubbling churn, when God's whim made the ocean a bubbling churn, and the flame in the lantern had started to burn, and the flame in the lantern had As the search for the beloved took turn after turn,
as the search for the beloved took turn after turn,
there were lacks of false loves,
there were lacks of false love,
but nowhere was the true Baba. Oh, Baba, oh, Baba, oh, Baba, oh, Baba, oh, Baba, Baba, oh, 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 Baba, Drops of blood in the dust are my eyes' fairest blue.
Drops of blood in the dust are my eyes' fairest blue.
For that ground of my death,
for the ground of my death,
will bear forth into view. Baba hoo, 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 Baba hoo.
I'm going to talk about my experiences when I met Baba as a child. And as I grow older, I realize more and more what a great privilege it was for me to have met him. Not just in the sense of anybody having met him, but to have actually met him as a child. There are many times when I wish that Baba was right here, right now, so I could ask him this, and he could direct me in this, and I wouldn't have to think about my life, he could just tell me what to do. And I often wonder what I would have asked him and how it would have been with him had I met him as an adult. But I realized as I grew older that I was really fortunate to meet him as a child, because basically the mind wasn't there to get in the way. And I had an extremely privileged, incredible experience meeting him, which I can never forget, I can't adequately describe. But as I say, the older I get, the more I appreciate the fact that I had that innocence and of being a child, and effectively I got away with an awful lot. You know, I was with Baba in a certain capacity, and I was treated in the way one would treat, you know, a favourite niece, and I received consequently this abundance of love, and I didn't question it. You know, I didn't have to think all the things you were talking about, Jack, about feeling unworthy. That I felt that a little bit when I met Baba the second time when I was 11. I was more conscious at that point, but really at age 7, which was the first time I had a proper meeting with him, I had no serious thoughts in my mind, apart from the ones that popped out when I asked Baba questions, but those were totally unpremeditated. So I really thank Baba that I met him then. I mean, I wish that I could have been born when Baba was born, and I could have died when Baba dropped his body, and I could have mirrored his life exactly, but I really do consider myself lucky. The other thing I want to say is that this talk is about my memories through a child's eyes, so a lot of it is me. You know, a 7-year-old child doesn't really see much of anyone else. It was just me and Baba, and of course the Mandali, especially Mera and Mani, who are the dearest people in the world to us, very much factored, but it was just Baba and I don't really remember too much about anyone else. So to start at the beginning, I think most of you know, but my father, Adi Jr., was Baba's youngest brother, and my mother, Franey, who you're going to hear speak on Saturday, I think. It's his wife, of course. And I have a brother, Dara Rani, who some of you may know from having gone to India. So I grew up in London, and as far as I know, we were the only members of Baba's family to be living so far away from him, which I think must have some significance. I have no idea what really, but that that was an interesting point of history, that we were that far away from him, but still in direct communication. Baba was absolutely the focus of our lives. So I was born into this family, and from the word go, I was raised to believe that Baba is God, and I never questioned it. And of course I was told that he was my uncle, and I never questioned that either. And in fact, in the way that 7-year-olds or 6-year-olds will do, I went to school and told all my friends that my uncle was God. But that, it just nobody paid much attention. But it wasn't serious, it was just, this was absolutely implicit in my mind, and there was no reasoning involved. I had been taken to India by my mother when I was 3 months old, primarily, I suppose, for my mother to take me to meet her family, but really, I believe, in order for me to meet Baba and for Baba to see me. And of course, I don't remember those, those times with him, but that was the first actual physical meeting I had with him. And then, just before I turned 7, the occasion came for my Naujat ceremony, which I don't know if any of you are familiar, but it's the equivalent, I suppose, of a Christian confirmation or a confirmation ceremony that you have at about age 7. And my grandfather and my mother, consequently, my paternal grandfather, was born into the Zoroastrian faith, and he was a traditionalist. And even though we followed Baba, of course, for the sake of my grandfather, really, my mother and father thought that I should at least have the first Zoroastrian ceremony performed on me as a child, or performed for me. And this was called the Naujat ceremony. It's a big event. And so, of course, I had to go to India for that. But more importantly than that, and really the main reason, was to finally go and meet Baba. So before we went to India, my father thought it was appropriate to... Was that an earthquake? MeherBaba ki jai.
It's a love quake.
We don't want... when I came here and I heard about the earthquake, I thought, I hope Baba doesn't just want us all to go together, because I'm really not ready for this. Okay. Just a little one. Okay. I'm in the right spot, though, aren't I? She said to be under the stage. Anyway, Baba, before we went to India, my father, where is he? My father decided very sensibly that he really ought to take me aside and actually try and explain to me exactly who we were going to see, and to talk to me about Baba seriously for the first time in my life. My father was an extraordinary man, and his conviction and love for Baba was extremely fiery and 100%. And he just had a way about him. I can't really describe it in this talk, but anyway, he was also quite strict. He was very loving to me, but I wasn't allowed to get away with very much. And he basically told me that MeherBaba is God. And it just so happens that I'm his niece and he is my uncle. And that I was going to India to meet my family, which would include my uncle, but by the way, he's God. So I asked him, I said, well, what does this mean, Daddy? And he then proceeded to really give me a set of instructions as to how I should behave. I mean, I'm sure when people nowadays take their children to India, you don't want them to behave like brats in front of the mandali. Well, this is Baba, I've been living in England. So my father was fairly precise. He said, I must show utmost respect, and that Baba was frail, that he'd been ill, and he wasn't young, that I shouldn't leap all over him, and basically observe the rituals of respect that you'd expect, from a child going to India to meet Baba, after all. So I took this in, and I was very curious and a little bit frightened, but not very. I was mostly just very, very excited. And I think my father just thought, well, he'll leave the rest to Baba. He's told me, and that's the end of it. So my family went to India in 1963.
No, you were in 64.
64, when I was 7. And we were planning to stay there for 3 months. And that's my mother, my father, my brother, and myself. And my father, being Baba's brother, was immediately, he went to Meherzad. He got to stay with Baba at Meherzad. And I didn't like this. I thought, why is he staying at Meherzad? I had to stay with my mother at my grandparents' place. So I was a little bit miffed about this. And I don't remember exactly the time span, but we didn't meet Baba the very first day we got there. Obviously, there was some settling in time. So my father was at Meherzad. I was with my grandparents, and just desperately waiting to meet him. And, my father would, just before he left, he kind of went over the whole list of rules again about what I should and shouldn't do, and everything was in my mind. And, you can imagine how nervous my parents were, really, because this was, I was kind of being presented to Baba in that sense. So finally the day came, and I think my father came in the car, and Baba sent his driver for us. And we got in the car, and we drove to Meherzad. And, I remember now, and I still feel that sense of excitement now, but I remember how excited I was once I got past the point where it says Meherzad Private Road, and then I just knew I was on my way to meet Baba, and I still feel very excited when I do that, when I go to India nowadays. So we drove along, and I was dressed up. My mother, this was the 60s, my mother had me dressed up like a pincushion. I was, all decked out in like frills and a tiara. I mean, it was patent shoes. It was just, I didn't like it, but this was how I was. This was how I was, all presented for Baba. And I remember the car parked, and we all got out, and Baba was in Mandali Hall. So I guess we went through to the back, through the garden. No. We approached from Mandali Hall from the front side, and I think I was last in line of my family to line in and cross the threshold and bow down to Baba. And my father had shown me, he said, put your hands together and bow down like this, nothing else. Don't kiss him, don't hug him, don't jump on him. So I had this, in my mind. I was wearing my tutu and my tiara, and this was all very, very new to me. And I remember very solemnly, following my family in, and my father kind of whispering. And just at the point where I crossed the threshold of Mandali Hall, Baba was sitting in his chair, and I went in front of him and I bowed down like that. And then I looked up, and Baba was sitting with his arms like this. So, what do you think I did? Did I listen to my father? No, I just ran into Baba's arms, jumped on him, sat in his lap, and he embraced me, and that was just it. I mean, that was as if a curtain, that everything my father had said completely fell by the wayside, and that was really the beginning of my Mani describes it as my romance with Baba. It was just so wonderful. Referring back to your talk, one thing that struck me, not so much then, but when I was 11, I was a little older and I could understand it, but what Baba did was he made me feel like the most important and special person in the world, and of course Baba did that with everybody, and only God can do that, because that nobody else could have made me feel the way he felt. He made me feel, and still be attentive to everyone else, which of course he was, but I didn't see that. I just saw the devotion he was showering on me, and I was just very, very fortunate. I mean, he did treat me just like the little niece who's come to visit. On that level, it was as simple and as sweet as that. So, of course, my father was just completely dumbfounded. But I think Baba must have given him some signal, as if to say, just don't worry about it, leave her with me. But that dynamic continued through the visit, with my father trying here and there to tell me to behave or not to be a pest or to do this, to do that. And as time progressed and Baba was giving me more and more attention, I became quite sort of bolshy and said to my father, well, Baba said I can do that, And so, who am I going to listen to? So my father it was really funny. My father didn't, he didn't say too much, but he just stressed that the main thing was not to disturb Baba or to make him tired. So our visit started with going to the car being sent to my grandparents and going to Baba, going to see him. And I just lived for those visits, and I really don't remember very much else that I did in India for those 3 months, apart from my marriage ceremony. But I was constantly waiting to be called. Baba just treated me so sweetly. I could sit by his feet, and he'd have in Mandali Hall, and he'd have a little bowl of soup, and he'd drink the soup, and then he'd give me the bowl of soup to finish. And at the time, I didn't really realize how lucky I was. I knew that I knew without question, even at that age, that I was with God. There was no, I defy anybody to look into Baba's eyes. And I remember thinking, in fact, looking into his eyes and thinking, I can see the whole universe in there. You know, like I could see ocean. It was really extraordinary. And to look away from his eyes was very hard. And another thing that Baba did for me that was really sweet and turned out to kind of have an adverse effect on me as far as my weight is concerned. But when I went to India at age 7, I was really thin. I think worryingly so. My mother was extremely concerned that I wasn't gaining weight, and I had bronchitis. And then we got to India, and I detested Indian food. You know, I just wouldn't eat it. And of course, it's all that was served to me. And very often we would eat with Baba in his dining room, which was wonderful. I have really, really special memories of just sitting in the dining room, just chatting, you know, almost like any family would do, getting together. And of course, like, I think everybody just about who's met Baba, Baba definitely spoke, you know, there's no question. I mean, I don't remember the gestures. I mean, he spoke to me. Of course, Erich was there somewhere, but that was my memory. Baba was speaking to me. And Mani very sweetly gave me her place on Baba's left. So I sat there, and Mera sat opposite on his right, and Baba at the head. And you know, Baba's favourite food, rice, dal, fish, would all be served, and it would come onto my plate, and I just wouldn't eat anything. And Baba didn't say anything, but I think my mother went to him and said, Baba, I'm really worried about Shireen. You know, she's not eating, and she's not gaining weight, and all this kind of thing. So the next time I went and had lunch there, my usual rice and dal and fish, you know, I just looked at it and I couldn't stand this stuff. And then Baba reminded me, your story reminded me, because I'd just seen it. Baba then took a handful of rice and dal from his plate and just plopped it in my mouth. I mean, I sort of turned around, my mouth was open, and in it went. And of course, you know, I knew I couldn't spit it out. I mean, I really would not eat this food. And I, in the split second I had, I knew that I couldn't spit it out, and what was I going to do, and if I gagged. But, you know, as it went in, it just tasted so good. It really tasted good. And rice and dal, I mean, it's my staple. You know, ever since then, I started eating, and I started gaining weight. So I have my mother to thank for that. I know, she's lost the weight that I gained. And Baba and I would play games. That was very special. Again, you know, to me, the significance, I didn't understand. But he was so jolly. He was so radiant. And there were moments when he'd be very still, but his hands would be working, and I would look at that and think, you know, what is he doing? And then he would then I would be looking at him, or I'd be thinking of him, and he'd turn around and he'd catch my eye, and he'd just turn into this beaming, jolly uncle figure. And he played. We had this wonderful game we play where I'd give him handkerchiefs, and then he'd knot them. Probably don't do it in America. It's a very English sort of seaside resort thing. You knot 4 corners of a handkerchief and you put it on your head. And it's just a way of making a little makeshift hat. And Baba and I would play this game where I'd do it, and then I'd put it on his head, and he'd put the hanky back on my head. And Mani was watching all the time, and she had me save, you know, obviously I saved all the handkerchiefs. And another thing that, before I go on, I just want to describe for those of you who, you know, who hadn't been there at that time, how different Meherzad was then. It was like a paradise. I mean, I don't mean that it's not a paradise today, because it is, but it's full of people, and there's a lot going on. You know, it's Baba's work and it's going on. But when we were there, we were so fortunate, because really there was no one apart from the Mandali, and I don't think there were any Westerners residents as such, apart from Rana, of course. And it was like the Garden of Eden. I mean, just visiting Baba and Mera and Mani in this beautiful garden. I used to run around, you know, I remember just running around the garden, and I used to ride Goher's bike, riding up and down, and it was so quiet and so still, and those times with Baba were so precious. You know, I had no idea, of course, but really stand out in my memory. Another thing that came up when I was with him, which I sort of knew about and was dreading, was that, of course, Baba loved entertainment. And if any of you have read Margaret Croft's book, you know what he put her through. I mean, this was nothing, but, you know, I was a 7-year-old, and I had to entertain him in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, I was completely talentless. I mean, I still am, really. I can't sing, I can't dance, you know, otherwise I'd be doing it right now. I can't do any of that stuff. And, but I knew I had to do something for Baba, so I think even at age 7, you know, he was kind of annihilating the ego a little bit, because there was a group of visitors, and they come to Mandali Hall, and when I was 7, Mandali Hall seemed a lot bigger than it is now. And I think Meher took me aside and said, "You've really got to do something, some little performance for Baba." And the only thing I could think of to do was to sing "All Things Bright and Beautiful." If you know, do you know the hymn? And you know my crackly what? Did you?
I don't know.
Oh, I thought you said sing no. Yeah. Thank you, Jen. No. But it was, you know, it was a very kind of twee, like English little hymn, and I learned it in assembly at school. It was just, I was so self-conscious that I had to stand up in front of, you know, Baba didn't have me do it in his bedroom with just my family in the Mandalay. He had me do it in Mandalay Hall with this group of people, and I really felt pathetic. I mean, that was the first time I just thought, oh God, you know, I'm not worthy of doing this. But anyway, I did my piece, and that was the end of that. But I did used to tell, I was good at telling jokes, and I told Baba jokes a lot. And he really laughed. He just humoured me because I tell him the same joke, you know, again and again and again. He just laughed every time. And I mean, to try and describe a sense of how it was, you know, I just didn't want to be away from him. And everything I had, I wanted to give to him. I mean, you know, my little toys, I'd give to him and I'd take them. And he lovingly would take occasions when we were having lunch with him. And of course, my father wouldn't be there. It would just be the ladies and Baba. As a special treat, we had, I think it was Australian tinned fruit salad. And you know those old like tinned fruit salad where there's like 2 cherries in the tin, or 3 cherries at most. You know, you get the fruit and then you get the cherries, but the cherries are just a few. So I think it was Katie who was serving this treat. And you know, I'd been eating my rice and dal at this point. So Baba said, "Oh Katie, give Shireen all the cherries in her bowl." So I received my bowl, and you know, I had the 3 cherries. And I ate, I said thank you to Baba, and I ate them and ate the fruit salad. And then at the end, Baba smiled at me and he said, "You know, you like that?" And I said, "Oh yes, Baba." And he said, "You want more cherries?" And I said, "Oh yes, Baba." And Katie said, "Well, Baba, no, there are no more cherries. You know, it's just 1 tin." And Baba said, "No, go and look." So she went to the bowl and she said, "Well, there are cherries." So he said, "Serve Shireen another bowl." So I got, you know, I think just like a few pieces of fruit and then the cherries. And I was really happy because, you know, I like the cherries. And I ate that, and Baba was just beaming. And he said, "Do you like those cherries?" And I said, yes, Baba. And he said, "Do you want more?" And Katie was just, "Baba, there are no more cherries." And at this point, I could sense a little bit that the people around the table were thinking, what's going on here? And Katie went back another time, and there were more cherries. And I'm not sure how many times it happens. Mani remembers the story and tells it, but it happened a number of times where it was completely impossible that there would have been cherries. And you know, for me, I was just thrilled. I was just thrilled that Baba was providing me with these cherries. But I mean, it really was quite extraordinary. So that was, you know, a very sweet and touching thing that Baba did for me. And then came the time, I don't know if it happened all in one go, but I started to ask Baba these questions, which have been, I think, written up in the family letters. And the strange thing about my asking him these questions is that I mean, they're apparently, you know, and in retrospect, quite sort of metaphysical. I mean, not metaphysical because they were couched in very childish terms, but I mean, they were about serious subjects. And I really wasn't the kind of child to think about Baba in that way. I wasn't, you know, thinking about who is he and how can he be and my relationship. You know, I was just a little girl. But I started to ask him these quite pertinent questions. And I think the first time I asked, you know, my parents stood absolutely aghast because I was just standing up there asking these outrageous questions and they didn't know how to stop me. And I'll mention the questions in a minute, but the funny thing is that I'm not at all cerebral in that sense, and that I don't really think about those kinds of topics. And moreover, when I was 11, one of the direct orders Baba gave me was to never read any of his books. So looking back, I almost feel as if Baba somehow just got that out of me at that age. And then, you know, the mind went blank. I mean, I just don't really think about these things. But I asked him, I had a list of questions from my friends from school because I told them I was going to meet my uncle who was God. So I had a list of questions from them. And with each response, you know, Baba answered so sweetly because he came down to my level and answered my childish question in a way that I could understand. But at the same time, he gave a universal answer that would satisfy anybody. But again, you know, I didn't know how lucky I was. So I asked him, my best friend wanted me to ask him which was higher, the sun, the stars, the moon, or the clouds. So I asked him this very solemnly. And he just looked at me and he said, "Tell your friend, I am the highest of the high." Thank you, Baba. And then I wanted to know if I'd have the same parents in my next life. And Baba said no. And that really upset me. And I was expecting him to say, "You'll have the same parents, you'll have the same life, I'll be here, everything will just be nice and hunky-dory." So then I didn't want to pursue that. And then I guess the sort of question that most people know about is, well, I have a real fear of snakes especially. So I wasn't thrilled to hear that there were snakes here. I have a fear of snakes, and when I was in India, age 7, I'd lived in England all my life. I'd never been exposed, to snakes, scorpions, none of that Indian stuff. I lived in the suburbs in England, and I was a real hypochondriac as well, and I just was terribly worried about all this stuff, and I dreaded the thought of encountering one of these creatures. So I asked Baba why he made scorpions, snakes, and spiders, things that I didn't like. And I expected his answer to be, "Oh, you don't like them, Shireen, I'll get rid of them." This was his sort of, the sort of wizardry phase. And instead, he answered quite seriously. The first thing he said to me was, he said, "Shireen, it was a twofold answer. He said, "Shireen, what do you think of when you see something like that which frightens you?" And I said, "Oh, I think of you, Baba." And he said, "See, you need to have something like that to remind you of me. Basically when times are good, you tend to forget. But when you're frightened, you think about Baba. That's a way of remembering Baba." And then he went on to say, this is putting it in very kind of childish, basic, that I could understand tones. But he said, "Shireen, when you go to the bathroom, what happens? You're so pretty, and you go to the bathroom and you come out with this really horrible mess." And he said, "That's part of you." And he said, "Both good and bad are mine." And that was a perfect answer for me. I mean, it's very simple, but I understood it. I didn't particularly like it, but I understood what he was saying. And then another question I asked him, because I was very concerned, I said, "Baba, are there such things as witches?" And he said, "Yes." And I thought, oh no. And I was really, really relying on him to say, "No, of course not." Instantly sort of visions of witches on broomsticks. And then he said, "No, witches are very bad people in the world." So that was okay. So I was happy with those answers. A couple of incidents. One thing that was very sweet and that reflects again on this fact that I don't remember Baba using gestures, and I just don't remember Erich. I love Erich, I just don't remember him being there. Baba used to have his rest, and I was given strict instructions not to disturb him. And of course I couldn't, always follow those instructions. So I used to ride Goha's bicycle, the bicycle she still has, by the way. She had it all those years ago. I used to ride it around the gardens at Meherzad, which, again, really seemed large to me. And I thought I made this wonderful discovery, but in fact, it had always been there. But I thought I discovered the side door to Baba's room. So I was sort of puttering about and riding my bike when he was having his nap. And I saw this door and this window, and I peeked in. And I saw the back, I guess, the back of Baba's head. And I thought, "Ooh, he's in there." I didn't understand. I mean, as a child, I just didn't understand that if I entered, from inside Meherzad, it was necessarily the same room as entering from outside. So I thought I made this great discovery. And I stood there and I thought, well, shall I go away? Shall I just stay here and wait for him to turn around and notice me? And a second later, he turned around and he beckoned me in. And so I tiptoed in, really feeling like the cat that got the cream. I really thought, this is great, in here with Baba on my own. And my memory of this time is that I was on my own with Baba, but I couldn't have been because I had a conversation with him and Erich was there to interpret. But I just remember going in and Baba's kind of half reclining in his bed, sitting up really sweetly and beckoning me to him. And we just sat and talked about very simple things like what I did at school, and how could I love him and how could I obey him. And then he asked me a question which, well, I'll never forget, but he said to me, "Do you think it's more important, or what do you think is the most important thing that you can do for me?" And I thought really hard about this, because I thought, well, to love Baba and to obey him are the two most important things. And I thought, well, I won't say to love him because to love him is easy, but to obey him is harder. So I said, well, to obey you, Baba. And then he didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "No, I want you to be happy." And even as a child, when he said that, I thought, "Oh, he's saying this to me. This is amazing. It's so sweet." And then I thought, "Oh, this means Baba is meaning I'm going to be happy for the rest of my life." Little did I know that this is something he was giving me, for the rest of my life. But it was really wonderful and a very touching moment. And then, of course, I got into trouble for going into his room. And as time went on, I, of course, became just so attached to Baba. I became very jealous of anyone else who got close to him. And I remember one time a singer came to... Do you remember her name? Mom, I don't remember her name. A famous... Begum Akhtar came to sing for Baba in Mandalay Hall, and that meant that not only was she there, but there was her entourage and a whole group of people. So my position right by Baba's feet, which is where I always was, when we went to see him, could sit by his feet, or I sat right next to him at the table, I was with him. My position was sort of moved several places down because there was something happening. So I was relegated this place pretty much near the back door of Mandalay Hall for the concert. And I was really feeling upset, just missing Baba terribly and feeling very jealous and thinking, "Oh, why isn't he, why don't these people go away? I don't like his singing," and, kind of thing that you think when you're a child, and I just want to be with Baba. And really feeling sorry for myself. And as I was thinking that, I kind of leant back a little bit to look at Baba, and just at that moment, he leant right back in his chair and looked at me and just went like that. And I felt really sort of shamefaced that I'd been thinking such selfish thoughts, but it was also a very, very sweet and touching moment. So then the time came for my Najat ceremony, and this was really a big deal. I mean, I was having to have prayers taught to me by the Zoroastrian priest, and I had this whole outfit, and a morning outfit and an afternoon outfit, and the whole ceremonial process was explained. It was quite a hard thing for a 7-year-old to follow, and it did involve an awful lot of prayers in Gujarati. Yeah. No, anyway, a lot of prayers in a language I didn't have a clue about, and I was really struggling with that. And there was a ceremony with a lot of pomp and circumstance. I mean, my grandfather was quite prominent in Ahmednagar, so everybody came, and there was a beautiful stage set up and garlands and flowers and everything. It was really exceptional. And the morning of that ceremony, Baba called me and the family to Meherzad, and I was to have the Zoroastrian ceremony in the afternoon. He called me, and part of the ceremony, the Zoroastrian ceremony, is to be given a sadra and a kasti. A sadra is the white undershirt, and a kasti is a cord that Zoroastrians wear around their waist always, and they say their prayers using it. So this was going to happen to me later on in the afternoon. But in that morning, Baba called me to him, and it was very quiet and still in Mandalay Hall, and he was sitting in his chair, and I had a little footstool in front of him. And very quickly and just very simply, he performed his own ceremony for me, for my Najat. And it was done before the official one. And I just stood in front of him and bowed my head, and he gave me the sadra and kasti. And then I stepped back, and it was just so simple and beautiful, and of course it was given from Baba. And, I didn't mention, but before this, Baba had told my mother that I was to learn the Paradigar prayer, which is quite hard, for a 7-year-old. And I was not only learning this prayer, I was learning my Zoroastrian prayers for this big brouhaha that was going to come, in the afternoon. So the morning of the, I think it was the morning of the Najat ceremony, while I had this, very intimate exchange with Baba, he asked me to recite the Master's Prayer in front of him on my little stool. And of course, my mother was holding her breath, was I going to say it right? Was I going to do... Anyway, somehow, by Baba's grace, I recited the whole thing to him and stepped back, and then I went off and did my whole shebang. But the funny thing is that it was, it went on for hours, and it was really grand. I didn't remember any of my prayers. And in fact, I mean, I was totally oblivious, but I was saying all this gibberish. And I remember one of my aunts, you know, because my aunts came with flowers and coconuts and incense. I mean, it was this whole scene. And one of my aunts on my sort of distant relation, not on Baba's side, she leant over to kiss me and she said, "Oh, Shireen," and she said, "Shireen, darling, you said everything wrong, but never mind." And then she went back, but it was just, I just thought it was so touching and, you know, a striking contrast to what Baba had given me, and then this big occurrence. Another wonderful memory from that time was playing with Baba's dog Mustan and Mani's dog Peter. Except Mustan was this huge animal, and I was not very tall, and I was really quite frightened of him, and of course I didn't want to show that fear to Baba. And he was a very beautiful dog, and Baba loved him very much. So I would kind of very hesitatingly pet Mustan, and Baba, you know, every time I'd see him, Baba would say, "Has Shireen seen Mustan yet?" I mean, that was actually be said, you know, he'd ask Meher, "Has Shireen seen Mustan yet?" So I would go to the back, to the kitchens, and pet him, but very, very gingerly. You know, I really was quite scared, and then come in to see Baba. And one day, I think it's on film, but one day Baba had me crack an egg and put it in a bowl and feed it to Mustan. I was just terrified, you know, to do that. I kind of had to crouch down, and Mustan was taller than I, and Baba was there watching, and I sort of just gingerly gave it. But he took the egg from me and ate it up, and he was really gentle. I mean, after that point, I just wasn't frightened of him at all. It was just a way, you know, Baba had of making me not be scared. So I guess then the next stage was when I met Baba when I was 11. Have I left anything significant out of the 7-year? Anyway, I can get back to that. But the next stage was when we went to India in 1968, 1969, which was the last time Baba was seen publicly, and of course shortly after that he dropped his body. But in the meantime, a couple of things had happened. Of course, leaving India was really hard and sad, saying goodbye, you know, I was very upset. But I knew we'd come back. I mean, I did have the sense that we would see Baba again. And what was so wonderful was that in those 4 years, Baba and I exchanged letters. And that was just, you know, so precious. I mean, for me to sit down and write to Baba and tell him all the little mundane things that had happened in my life. And then to have Baba respond to those things and respond to my questions and, you know, little trivial things that meant such a lot to me. And Baba took them very seriously. And just to give the background, I mean, we didn't do, as a family, we didn't do anything without letting Baba know or asking his advice. I mean, no decision virtually was made in our family without direct contact with him. So even though we were far away from him, it was as if he was there. You know, he was absolutely the centre of our lives. So telegrams would go back and forth, you know, for birthdays, and when, you know, my dog hurt himself and Baba would send a telegram. It's just so sweet, and so the contact was there. And I remember, you know, sending him these letters with just like hundreds and hundreds of kisses and hearts. I remember one time Meher wrote back and said, you know, "Shireen, darling, not so many kisses. Baba can't see. You know, Baba wants to read what you write." And I have atrocious handwriting as well, so I really had to struggle to make it neat. And two things happened that stick out in my memory before I went back to India. One was that my father went to see Baba when Baba was in seclusion in 1968. Is that right? Just before we went. And my father was very privileged to do that because Baba had been in strict seclusion, but my father called him, especially to be with him. And I was, of course, extremely envious. I wanted to go desperately myself. And I sent a whole list of questions and love and, you know, all sorts of trinkets and gifts and things I did with my father. And in addition to all that, I sent a request to Baba via my father. And I didn't mention, but when I was 7, and until I was 11, I had really long hair down to about my hips. It was very long and thick. And when we went to India in 1963, when I was 7, Baba really loved my hair. He played with it, you know, he fondled it, he stroked it, and I would sit in front of him, you know, he'd caress my hair. And I wanted my hair cut at some point after that. You know, all my friends had short hair. I was the only one who went to school with my hair in these 2 plaits, you know, and it took my mother hours to do it in the morning. We'd fight, you know, I wanted short hair like my friends. So for a decision like that, because Baba had shown such fondness for my hair, we asked Baba if I could have my hair cut, and the answer was absolutely not. I couldn't have it cut. So I was only a child, remember, I wouldn't do this now. So when my father went to see Baba, I sent a message with him saying, please ask Baba if I can have my hair cut. You know, I really want to be like everyone else. So I got a postcard from my father while he was in India. And he said, you know, Shireen, you will be so excited. Your wish has been granted. Baba has said you can have your hair cut. And I was like, 8 inches, which for my length of hair was a trim. It was nothing more than just, you know, it was just a trim. I thought, oh no, sorry, I had the 8 inches cut off, but it was just in the back of my mind that I really wanted to get my hair cut. And the other thing that happened just before we went to see Baba in 1968 was that I started going to St. Paul's School, which is the school that Kitty Davey went to. And it's one of the oldest, most established, esteemed schools in England. It's an all-girls public, very pucker, you know, kind of traditionalist kind of school. And in fact, it's where Kitty met Gustav Holst, and Kitty said that Gustav really led her on the spiritual path. So there was a nice connection there. But the main thing is that Baba told my parents, in England at age 11 you enter senior school, Baba told my parents I had to go to St. Paul's. And my parents said to him, well, Baba, you know, this is a really hard school to get into. And frankly, Shireen's just not that bright. You know, there's an entrance exam, and the likelihood is not, you know, it's quite slim. And my teachers definitely confirmed that. You know, there's no way I was going to get into the school. But I sat the entrance exam for St. Paul's and for about 4 other private schools. Baba just said, try, you know, try to get in and sit the other exams too. But definitely, if I got into St. Paul's, I was to go to that school. So it was all really just almost considered a joke. I mean, in terms of whether I'd get in or not, it was completely up to Baba. And in fact, the day I took my exam, I had German measles and didn't know it. In England, they're really tough. It was a 3-hour exam for 11-year-olds. And I was really sick, and I walked out. I didn't even complete the paper. So, of course, I should never have got in on that basis alone. But I like to think that, of course, Baba arranged it, but I like to think that the sort of material hinge or hook that got me in was this, because it just so happened that the woman who was the high mistress, not the head mistress, this was the high mistress, you had to curtsy when you saw this lady, she was the ruler of the school. She had been Mountbatten's secretary in India, and she was a great fan of India and anything to do with India. And I remember before my interview, my father was actually in India, I think, when I took the exam for St. Paul's. He was with Baba. But before my interview, my father had written to me and said, whatever you do, just remember that the Prime Minister of India is Indira Gandhi, because this Mrs. Munro, this is the High Mistress, is bound to ask you this. So I went into my interview and, you know, I acted like a complete, I mean, I wasn't sophisticated, and this was a really sophisticated kind of establishment. And I just realised I was talking complete gibberish. I had a fever, you know, at this point. And then she said, now, Shireen, can you tell me who is the Prime Minister of India? And I said, oh, Indira Gandhi, I know that. And that was it. And I left, and I got in. And, you know, about 10 of my friends who did much better in school, in junior school than I did, they didn't get in, and their parents were so peeved that, you know, I got in, and it's like, and Adi and Franny were just unbelievable. It's a miracle. It was the first, one of the first miracles Baba performed in my life. So that was just something that happened before I was already going to that school, and it was a wonderful experience for me. And of course the connection with Kitty, who my family was very close to. Do I have time to?
Yeah, you have, it's 10 of 10 about.
Okay. So the next visit was in 1968-69, December of 68-69. My father came back and he had some wonderful stories, but there's no time to tell you that now. And this was a very different visit for me insofar as I was 4 years older, and even at that age I was still a child, but definitely I was much more conscious of who I was, and really how unworthy I was, and who Baba was. I mean, the mind had started working at that point, and I was thinking a lot more. But the reason we went to India was for Dara and Amrit's wedding, which was a wonderful, really moving occasion, and it was the last time Baba came out. So that involved a lot of preparation for my parents. You know, Baba, primarily, he arranged it in India. I mean, it was a big occasion. So that was the reason for going. But of course, I'm sure the reason was that we went and it was the last time we were to see Baba. So this time when I went in, I remembered myself what my father had told me about going in to see Baba and showing the respect. And I really was a lot more nervous. You know, I was 11 and I'd done naughty things, you know, and Baba knew about them. So I was thinking along those lines as well. And this time Baba was in bed. He wasn't in Mandalay Hall. And he definitely looked unwell. And I was immediately conscious of that. But he's still lying down. He still held out his arms to me. And I still went and lay on his chest. And, you know, I'll never forget that, just putting my head on his chest and being embraced by him. But, you know, this time being more conscious to put some weight on the bed and not be too much of a burden. And despite his illness, Baba still gave us so much time. And I feel the visit when I was 7, of course, was very significant and special. But when I was 11, I really felt Baba was giving me everything in that one meeting, because he knew he wouldn't be there in the body afterwards for me. So a lot of what happened then was the preparation for the wedding, and whether Baba would in fact be well enough or not to come out and preside. And in the end, for those of you who've seen the film, you know that he did, and he was just beautiful. You know, seconds before he was in his bedroom, so ill and unable to move, and then he came out and just sat in the chair looking absolutely glorious. It was incredible. But for me, again, you know, the same thing happened with my father kind of telling me what to do, and me saying to him, this time saying to my father much more openly, no, you know, I'm with Baba now, I'm going to do whatever Baba wants me to do. And I remember one time, you know, this sounds awfully like boasting, but one time I was so thrilled because I was supposed to go to Meherzad, and I didn't go because my father decided that Baba really was too unwell to see me. So my father had come to visit my mother and I, and basically came to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take you with me to see Baba. And of course, you know, we were both very disappointed, and I was upset. And then about 40 minutes later, the Baba's car drove up to my grandparents' house again. And my father was in the car, and I said, you know, what are you doing? He said, I've come to take you to Baba, because apparently when my father got there, he said to Adi, where's Shireen? And my father said, well, Baba, I really didn't think you were well enough to see her. And Baba said, no, go and get her. So, I mean, just imagine how I felt. It was so wonderful and so, you know, so gracious of Baba and so sweet of him. And this time, too, I took, you know, my gifts, and I tried to make, you know, I wasn't very creative, but I tried to make some kind of object. I think I made an owl. It was really awful. In fact, Auntie Mera said, you know, she said, Shireen, next time, not such bright colours. It was a sort of papier-mâché, like purple and lurid pink, you know. And it was put up on one of the little cupboards in the dining room. But Baba just took it so sweetly. And I didn't mention when I went before, he'd given me this little koala bear that was my gift. And he gave me many gifts, which obviously I still have. And again, the entertainment came up. And at this point, thanks to my mother, you see, I was quite chubby. And feeling very self-conscious. I was at that kind of awkward, you know, age, not feeling very pretty and dignified to be in front of Baba. And moreover, not only that, Dara and Amrit's wedding was going on, and Vilu's granddaughter, Homai, who was about 8 at the time, just very pretty and delicate and thin, was going to do an Indian dance, a Kathak dance, I think, for the wedding. And I'd seen her practicing, and she was just great, you know. And my effort was ballet, because Mera had really wanted me to study ballet. And according to Margaret Crask's advice, I started studying it at 8. And I was actually quite good at it, but I didn't know it. I was very self-conscious. So all I could offer Baba this time, apart from my jokes, which he really liked and which I was very good at, was my ballet dance, which was truly pitiful. It was just, you know, I was very ungainly, I was overweight, I didn't have any music with me. But I had to do this. It was the tarantella thing, and I had to do my tambourine, and I wore a little headscarf and an apron. I looked completely ridiculous and just felt so embarrassed. And with no music, Mera and Mani were clapping time. And I think, in fact, I did it in Baba's bedroom because he wasn't well enough to be in Mandalay Hall, so the space was very limited. And I really just clumped about like an elephant. Ding, ding. And I was so conscious, and my cheeks were burning, and I thought, oh, I'm doing this, and I'm doing this for Baba. And in a couple of days' time, this little girl's going to be doing this wonderful dance. It was quite humiliating. And Anyway, but I did it, and Baba was very sweet. He embraced me afterwards and said how wonderful it was, and how lovely it was. And anyway, I gave up ballet, and not long after that, it was just not going to happen. But I did tell Baba these jokes, and I don't think I'll have time, but at some point I'd really like to tell you the jokes, because he laughed so much, and I told them again and again and again, and he really did come to life. He was very ill at this point, lying on his back, but I'd sit with him, and he'd say, Shireen, tell me some jokes, and I'd say, well, Baba, I only know these 3 jokes, and he'd say, tell them again, and he really laughed. But what's so funny or ironic is that the jokes came from a man called Dave Allen, who's an Irish comedian, who's really popular in England, but he was at his heyday then. I mean, he's still renowned now. And he is a lapsed Catholic. He's been excommunicated, several times by everybody, like every religion. And his jokes are at the expense of the church and God, but specifically the Catholic Church. He hated the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the only jokes he told were these irreverent, irreligious, jokes. And at the end of every show, he'd sit there like, he's Irish. I mean, he's there with his whiskey and soda and on a bar stool, really smoking a cigarette, really laconic, very dry, very wry. And at the end of his show, he'd say, "Good night, and may your God go with you," which we just loved. My father adored him. So I told Baba these Dave Allen jokes, and Baba just loved them. And I never did it, but I really wanted to write to Dave Allen, and say, you don't know who heard your jokes, but it just so happens that God actually really liked them. The Pope might not have liked them. God thought these jokes were great. So that was really nice for me as well, to do something for Baba that I felt I was doing well enough. Can I tell them that, because I really want to say more. All right, Baba laughed at this. Remember this. Baba laughed at this. So even if I don't tell it so well now, okay. 2 naughty boys lived close by to an apple orchard, and there was a huge brick wall separating the apple orchard from the road. And on the road was the vicarage where the vicar lived, right? Vicar, like priest. And the boys would go and steal apples from the orchard, and they took a sack each, and as they took them, they go, one for you, one for me. They had one sack between them, and they kind of go, one for you, one for me, one for you, trying to count the apples as they went in, but basically they knew they'd have to count them again. So they got onto the wall in such a way that they couldn't be seen from the road. And the apple orchard, I forgot to mention, was in a graveyard. That's right. The apple orchard was in a graveyard. This was a long time ago, so you have to forgive me. The apple orchard was in the graveyard. They're sitting on the wall, counting out their apples behind this wall where no one can see them. So they're going, one for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. Meanwhile, the vicar, this is in Ireland, this is in Ireland, therefore the vicar had been having some Guinness. So he walked past the wall, the graveyard wall, really drunk, and he's kind of walking along, and then he's hearing, one for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. So he becomes very, very worried. He says, oh my God, God and the devil are counting out the souls in the graveyard. He said, I've got to go and tell whatever the next stage up on the vicar is. It's like this hierarchy, but like the superior vicar. I have to tell him. So he sort of staggers along, saying, that they're after us, that our souls are going to be taken, God and the devil. So he knocks on the door of the superior. It's in the middle of the night, and the man opens the door and says, what is it? What do you want? And he says, you must come. God and the devil are counting out the souls. Now, as he's having this conversation, the boys drop 2 apples on the other side of the wall into the road. And one of them says, oh, we dropped those 2. And the other boy says, don't worry, we'll count them in at the end. Don't worry, we'll just keep going, one for you, one for me, one for you, one for me. So this has happened, and then the vicar is completely drunk and very, very worried about the fact that he's going to be taken by God or the devil. Has come with his superior, and his superior is really angry. It's the middle of the night, and he says, you do this kind of thing all the time, you're just drunk, go home, go to bed. No, you must come. So he pulls him along, and they stand outside the graveyard wall, and sure enough, they can hear, one for you, one for me, one for you, one for me, and there's no one to be seen. So the superior vicar says, oh my God, this is, you're right, brother, whatever. The time has come, gather the people. And then suddenly there's silence. And then a voice says, well, what about the 2 outside? Do you get it? Anyway, that was his favourite. That was his absolute favourite. So I told this joke many times, and there was another joke about a nun who used to like to drink. I mean, the first time I told them, my father was just sitting there with his eyes just bulging out. Like, what is she doing? That Barbara really liked it. I'll try and be quick. Well, I'd really like to tell, because some quite significant things happened at that point. Two things, well, a lot, but anyway. I'll talk about my hair. This was close to the end after the wedding. I don't think I've got time to talk about Darren Umrit's wedding, really. But this fixation with my hair, you know, had continued, and I really was determined, I'm afraid to say, to get Barbara to agree to let me have my hair cut. And this is why I say I'm really glad I didn't meet him as an adult. You know, I think I got away with a lot. I mean, I hope I wouldn't have done this as an adult. I would have known better. But instead of thinking, I'm so fortunate, Barbara loves my hair, I'll keep it long and be grateful that he's even interested in something like my hair, I persisted and wanted to have it cut. And towards the end of our stay, I went to Mera, because I thought sneakily, you know, Barbara's not going to refuse Mera anything. I said, Mera, auntie, please go to Barbara and ask him if I can have my hair cut. So she did go. You know, bearing in mind that this request had been made many times before, but this time the answer came back that yes, I could have my hair cut. And when I got that message, instead of being really happy, I just felt really down. You know, I didn't feel happy in the way I should have done, and in fact I felt as if I'd made a big mistake, but I didn't quite know why. And that not only had Barbara said yes, you can have your hair cut, but he said I had to have it cut while I was there in India, that my mother had to do it, that I had to go and see him as soon as I'd had it cut, and that it could not be cut above about shoulder length, and that it could never be cut any shorter than that. So this was the whole agreement. And as I was sort of listening to all this, my heart just sank. You know, I didn't like the sound of this, and I really wanted to go back. I wished I had never said that, but it was too late, of course. And I remember really distinctly going back to my grandparents' house, and they had a beautiful balcony. And sitting on the balcony, I had one thick plait, and my mother just took the scissors and went like that, you know. And this huge clump of hair just dropped on the ground. I mean, really a lot, you know, like that much hair. And I just felt so awful. And either that, I think that day, or certainly first thing the next morning, as asked, I went back to see Barbara. And I felt so sheepish when I went in to see him, and Barbara looked so sad. And I felt, so, you know, I just felt dreadful. And he felt my hair, and it was much thicker than it is now, so it was really kind of a blunt cut and thick, and he put his hand under it, and he said, never any shorter, and he just, you know, stroked it, and he looked really sad. And anyway, there's a lesson in there. I mean, and I think the lesson is, I mean, my hair's falling out. It's just, I've been trying to grow my hair ever since then, really. I felt, I haven't felt right about it. And I talked to Money because I've had this dilemma. I've wondered, well, I pestered Barbara so much, should I just keep it short? You know, because after all, I drove him crazy asking him, should I at least have the good grace to keep it short? Or should I, in fact, grow it long, which is how he liked it in the first place? So I'm sort of in between at the moment. That was one lesson I think he taught me. And another similar incident where I just didn't know, to keep quiet, was I was very anxious to climb Seclusion Hill. And when I went to India when I was 7, I asked Barbara if I could do so, and he said, absolutely not. And I think I must have said to him something like, well, can I climb it next time I come? And I don't remember whether he said yes or no, but it was very, very vague. And anyway, when we went there, I really wanted to climb Seclusion Hill. So I kept, again, pestering Barbara, kind of asking him, asking Mera to ask him, asking my father to ask him. And again, finally, he said yes, but with a look in his eye that made me, think, oh, well, was this the wise thing to have done? So we went off on an expedition. I think my father was there, my mother, my brother and sister-in-law. Darren and Umrit were married at this point. This was just before Barbara dropped his body. And some servants and some friends. So a whole lot of us. And I'm frightened of heights. And I'm also a complete, wimp about snakes. And then it occurred to me that there might be snakes up on Seclusion Hill. Anyway, to come to the point, oh, and not only that, everyone else was wearing sensible shoes, but I wore sandals and shorts. You know, I wasn't appropriately dressed. So I think I got about a third of the way up, and I looked down and just decided I wasn't going to go any further, and I had a fit, you know, I had a tantrum. I couldn't go up, I couldn't go down, I was really frightened. I started imagining snakes coming to get me, and scorpions, and the whole, you know, all these things that I'd asked Papa to remove, but he hadn't. And I ended up becoming so hysterical that I sat right in a bed of nettles. It's like something like a cactus. I mean, right in it, and I was in absolute agony. So the upshot was that I was carried down by 4 people. You know, the whole trip was cancelled, and I was carried down, taken to a little room where Mera spent about an hour and a half with tweezers taking the pins out of me, the thorns out of me. So, you know, this was the end of my great expedition up Seclusion Hill. So, sort of just at the point, you know, where the last thorn had been removed, I was really in agony. I got a message that Baba wanted to see me. So you can imagine what was going through my mind, but I didn't know what was to come. So I went in again very sheepishly to see Baba, and you know, he had this smile on his face, and he said, "Oh, Shireen, did you enjoy your trip up to Seclusion Hill?" And I said, "Oh, Baba, you know, well," and I didn't know what to say, and I said, "Well, Baba, you know, I got a little bit frightened, and I'm afraid I didn't want to go up," and I sort of told him what happened, and of course I knew that he knew, but he didn't make anything of it really. And then afterwards I found out the whole time, from the minute we'd set off, he had asked Mera Auntie to stand at the window with binoculars and watch the progression and report to him on everything that was going on. So he had had a detailed description of every single ridiculous, humiliating thing that I did. So I really felt that, you know, he was teaching me a lesson, but it was a very gentle one because I was only 11. At that time, he gave me some other orders too, which I was to follow for the rest of my life. And he then gave me the order I mentioned about not reading any of his books, which, you know, he just said it and I accepted it. But of course, it's quite an interesting order, and I don't know anyone else who's been told that. And I've taken it a little bit further than perhaps Baba intended. I try, when I'm, say, reading, you know, Kitty Davies' book, which of course has passages and such from Baba, I do skim over that. So I'm actually not terribly well informed of the facts, you know, and I don't know if that's a blessing or, but, you know, of course, coming from Baba, it's a blessing. But interestingly, he had my father, who was very intellectual, but also full of heart. He had my father read God Speaks 7 times in a row. That's that time I told you when Baba called my father when he was in seclusion in 1968. And my father just spent that whole time reading God Speaks. You know, getting up earlier and earlier, going to bed later and later, lighting the hurricane lamp. Each time my father would finish it, and Baba would say to him, "Did you understand it?" And my father would say no. And this happened. And about the 3rd time, Baba said, "Well, don't you understand English?" And my father said, "Well, Baba, I understand English, but I'm never, you know, I cannot say I understand God Speaks, only you can understand that." And the 7th time, my father gave the same answer, very sensibly, he gave the same answer, and Baba said, "Fine." So, you know, my father read God Speaks 7 times, I'm not even allowed to really open the book, so that's an interesting touch. Do I have time for much more?
2-3 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just talk about when we left, and then didn't see Baba again after that. This was a much shorter visit. It was about 6 weeks, and there had been a lot going on, and Baba wasn't well. And saying goodbye to him was extremely difficult. And one thing that happened this time was that each one of us, I think, had more time with Baba on our own. I mean, I remember many occasions when Baba would just embrace me, and nothing really was said. And one time, towards the end, he was resting, and everyone had been sent out to do something else, not to disturb him. But I just, you know, I just didn't go. I mean, I was waiting, basically waiting for Baba to call me or to get up. I was sort of lurking around. And it so happened that Amrit was at Merazar too. She was inside the house because I think she hadn't been very well. So we were the only 2 who were there who really shouldn't have been there. And Baba was resting, and I'm not sure about Erich, but Arnavaz was sitting in Baba's room. And suddenly Baba gestured to Arnavaz and said, where's Shireen? And she said, oh, she's actually just around the corner outside your door, just there. And then he said, where's Amrit? And she said, well, she's here too. And he said, call them. And Baba called both of us in. Amrit and I had just met at this point. She's my sister-in-law, but we had just met. And Baba took both of us. We knelt in front of him, and he was half reclining on the bed. And he took both of us, and he held our heads to his chest and held them there for a really long time. And of course, Arnavaz was watching all this. And all I remember is being engulfed by Baba's love and embraced by him, and how wonderful it was to be with him. And then he said to Amrit and I, you are sisters. And then, really, I didn't think much about that moment. But many years later, after many things happened in my family, and Jay and I went to India and spoke at length to Arnavaz, she said, when I sat there and watched that, she said, my heart really broke in two for you and Amrit. She said, I had never, ever seen Baba do that with anybody before, to hold them so closely and so tightly for so long. And she said, I really felt for you, because I felt that Baba was giving you so much love and courage, as if to say he knew that we were going to each of us have a tough life ahead of us, and each of us have, But that was the feeling Arnavaz had, the overwhelming feeling of Baba really giving us that courage to sustain us. And I do feel that's true, because of course he hasn't been in my life physically, and we haven't, by all accounts. You talk about how much Baba loves us, how much we suffer, And Baba did say that his family would suffer, and it's definitely not easy being part of Baba's family. So that love and courage has been with us, because without it, I don't know what we would have done. So even though he hasn't been there physically, he's been, in my life at every single juncture. So then the time came to say goodbye to him, and it was just, it was just awful. Everyone was crying, and I knelt in front of Baba, and he embraced me, and he again repeated to be happy and to remember him and not to worry. And then I said to him, Baba, can I stay with you next time? And he said yes. And that really gave me a good feeling, because I thought, well, this means he's going to be here next time for me to stay with him. And anyway, we said our goodbyes and got on the plane, and I was fine at this point. I was on the plane and I was on my way home, and I just was imagining that I would resume my letter writing to Baba. And I just apparently just burst into tears for no reason. We'd taken off and suddenly started crying out of the blue, and my mother asked me what was wrong, and I said, I'm not going to see Baba again. And then that thought just left me. So it was just a sudden thought, and then it went. And we got back to England, and I guess about 3 weeks later we heard the news that he dropped his body, which would take about another hour to talk about, so I don't know if I should draw this to a close. But at that point we heard that Baba was no longer with us physically, and my impression at that time was, my immediate impression was that the world was going to end. I really thought, that the world would stop, and I actually thought, well, I won't have to go to school, and everything's just going to crumble. And then, of course, that didn't happen. And well, I'll talk about this in my next talk, but then it was just so how wonderful how Baba just is as if he left our lives and then he re-entered the same second, because he was with us all along. And there are so many wonderful stories of how he showed his hand in just about everything that we ever did, and there's no question that he was still with us, and many touches after the entombment and such, which I can talk about later since it's late. Some of you are asleep. Shall I close it now?
And our
Okay.